evening, everybody, and welcome to my special guest today, Gabriella Russo. How are you doing?
Good, thanks. It's really brilliant to be here. It's taken us a bit of time, but here we are.
Got there in the end.
Really excited to be here. Lovely to be able to chat to you a little bit more than we have done in the past.
Yeah.
And because it's always been like it's been a busy room or it's been online and sort of messages, hasn't it? So yeah, great to be here.
Yeah, thank you for joining. I'm really excited to have you as a guest. For a bit of context for those watching, I met Gabriella at the National Working Group on Spiritual and Ritual Abuse, which took place, it was a couple of months ago now, wasn't it? Maybe a month and a half
Yeah.
ago.
Yes.
Where it was a really good conversation. We just kind of briefly met then, and Gabriella spoke about safeguarding and neurodiversity. And I thought that this would actually be a perfect opportunity to have you on the channel and talk a bit more about it. So do you want to start off maybe by introducing yourself? Like, what do you do? Why are you here? You know, safeguarding, what is it? All of that big stuff. Because
Okay.
you're definitely more qualified than I am to talk about it.
So as you said, I'm Gabriella. I'm self-employed, so I run my own business as a safeguarding and neurodiversity consultant, trainer, speaker, whatever is helpful and useful. I have been in the world of safeguarding for over 30 years, not necessarily directly in terms of having sole responsibility for safeguarding on its own, but in terms of working with children and young people as well. And then within that, I've done training and delivered training and been part of safeguarding issues. I worked in anti-human trafficking for a while, and I was a manager at the NSPCC, working on the anti-abuse programme in primary schools. And then when I left there, I set up my own consultancy. Alongside that, in the last sort of 9 or 10 years, I discovered my neurodiversity, the fact I'm neurodivergent, and in working through some of that, working through some of my story, which I'm be happy to talk about as we go through, began to really understand the crossover, the intersection of safeguarding and neurodiversity, also mental health. So like my big thing is you can't separate those three. Because they all impact each other. And if you only understand one, you don't fully understand it. Like that's my big kind of bee in my bonnet soapbox. And so now I deliver safeguarding neurodiversity training to local authorities, to businesses, charities. I do some one-on-one work, do some consultancy, writing policies, that kind of stuff. And as part of that, became a member of the National Working Group Against Spiritual and Ritual Abuse. And I'm now actually working with Jordan, who is the chair, who I believe you had on a couple of weeks ago.
Yes.
And I'm now working with him, delivering the training on spiritual and ritual abuse. That's his CPD training. So we're now working on that together. So there's two of us delivering it in the country now, which, hopefully we'll be able to get that out a bit further and sort of make a bit of a difference. So that's what I do. I have experienced spiritual abuse. I've somehow held on to my faith. Everyone has a different path with regards to that. But I'm working very much in that arena as well. And just, I'll do whatever comes my way that fits with the things that I have kind of the ability and knowledge to kind of support people with.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think safeguarding is so important. I mean, you know, when you look at the world of big corporates and government bodies and agencies, you know, everyone hears the word safeguarding and it's kind of like a buzzword and everyone's like, oh yeah, we've got a safeguarding policy. But this is one thing I touched on with my conversation with Jordan last week, was that, you know, it's all very well and good having a safeguarding policy, but, you know, it doesn't mean anything if you're not actually following it or applying it. And I suppose the question for you is like, how does that look from your perspective? Do you get a lot of companies and local authorities going, cool, yeah, we need a safeguarding policy and that's kind of it? Like, or do they need help implementing it? Like, what are the sort of challenges you face?
I would say that more so with local authority, to be fair. If you know they have policies. Sorry, by the way, for anyone who's watching, I do have a cat. So that was the tail that just went across. She may come back and wave her butt at the camera or something at some point. But I'm not superstitious. She is a black cat and I absolutely adore her. Anyway, she'll be back for treats. Right, that totally distracts me. Yeah. So, for example, local authorities, they have policies. They obviously have to have policy that supports the policies for their frontline workers and so on. So, there is kind of a policy guidance. I'm going to be working on some guidance for one local authority very shortly around online safety, and there's policy, and then you write guidance that is sort of easier to kind of digest in terms of this is how you should implement this, and then delivering the training as well. So I would say on the whole, local authority, don't just. I think companies don't necessarily realize that safeguarding matters to them as a business, because I think part of the thing with safeguarding is that initially people think that safeguarding is about children. And then if they're thinking a bit broader, they'll be like, okay, so vulnerable adults, but actually it's for everybody, because people have vulnerabilities that we're not necessarily expecting. We've seen, the stuff that's come out in the Me Too movement, for example, or you look at some of the television companies like the BBC, like what a mess that keeps coming out of the BBC, with, different characters and people that are then shown to have been abusive in some way. They've kind of abused their power and all that kind of thing. And so it's become more and more clear that actually, businesses need to understand safeguarding as well, because it's not just about your clientele. So, okay, if you're talking about kids, teachers need to understand safeguarding for the children, but actually you need to understand it for your staff, even if your staff aren't made up of a whole bunch of, your staff aren't going to be children anyway, but they're not made up of a whole bunch of incredibly vulnerable adults, or people with learning disabilities, or things that would make them stand out as vulnerable. Every organisation, every business needs to have some sort of understanding of safeguarding, and I think that's the bit that's missed in terms of recognising its value. Whether policies are fully followed, whether training is completely kind of taken on board, none of us can have full control over that when we're in sort of delivering it or talking about it. And that's a matter of culture as well, which has to be top down.
Yeah, absolutely.
So, yeah.
I think
because like you said, they have a policy and they think they've ticked the box. No.
Yeah.
I mean, I've worked in so many places where they've got the policy and then you discover they're not really following really key pieces of the policy. So
yeah, of course. And it's so important that everybody understands the importance of safeguarding, because, whether it's a local authority or a business, put it this way, if you run your own company, it doesn't, doing whatever, and you employ someone and that person just so happens to be a Scientologist or an ex-Scientologist, or, a member of any other cult for that matter,
right.
They're going to be going through their own personal journey of suffering, of hardship, of family difficulties, and so on. And so, although as an employer it's not your job to help them with that, I suppose it is your job to make sure they are protected and safe when they're at work. And in order to do that, you need to have an understanding of how these things work, right? And you have to be watching out and looking out for these people, right?
For sure. And I think it's even an interesting one. So looking at this training that Jordan and I deliver on spiritual and ritual abuse, I, for example, with the Church of England, and I'm not calling it out in a negative way, but when I've gone through safeguarding training as someone who used to run kids' work in a Church of England church, there was a section on spiritual abuse, but it was about Christian spiritual abuse, the misuse of the Bible and how it is in churches. And I would argue that any faith needs to understand all kinds of spiritual and ritual abuse, because you might have someone who comes from something that they're escaping from and then comes to your church or your mosque or whatever. And if you only understand how spiritual abuse works within your faith context, you're not necessarily going to be able to look after somebody who's come from a different context. Do you see what I mean? So it's no good just training what might happen with us. It's understanding the full breadth of how it works.
Absolutely. And what are the sort of challenges you face when it comes to religious groups. I mean, I don't know if you saw the video I did with Jordan, but we chatted a bit about safeguarding within churches and within cults specifically, and the challenges with having, for example, mandated reporting, right? If you are a religious minister and you're aware of someone being abused by their faith in some way, or another pastor or whatever, you should therefore report that, and there's a process in place to investigate and so on. But when it comes to cults, for example, you know, they may not be inclined to report it because you know, there are policies that say you can't report another Scientologist on another, or you know, in order to handle this you need to deal with it within the group, and it may not be in their best interests as a cult to implement safeguarding and for example report stuff. So what are the challenges that you face when it comes to things like mandatory reporting and safeguarding in religious groups?
I think I'm going to be really fair, because there's a whole bunch of different people, right? There are people who don't know anything about safeguarding. Okay, so might be people in the congregation who just rock up to their church or wherever, and they like it there. They feel safe. Maybe they don't recognise me. It took me a long time to recognise that I was going through spiritual abuse, despite the fact that I'm a safeguarding professional. Because when it's you, it's a whole different ball game, and we'll talk about the neurodiversity piece within that as well later on. Then you've got people who genuinely want to implement and are balancing being trustworthy with holding in private what people have trusted them with. And where's the line with that? When does an adult have the right to say, I don't want that dealt with, I just need to talk about the situation? And I think within that, anyone needs to report and deal with anything that's current. But if someone's coming with something that's very much in the past, it's a little bit more up to that person. They might want to deal with the situation, but work on whether they kind of go forward with something that happened 20 years ago. So I think that can be tricky. And then you've got some people who'll be like, whatever happens, I'm passing it on. I'm not going to make decisions on my own. And that might, for some people in a congregation, that might make them feel like they can't talk to somebody. So it can be a very delicate, tricky balance of reporting when you should, and when it's a live concern, when it's someone within, say churches, your denomination, you absolutely have to, particularly if they're still operating, even if it's in a different church but still within your denomination or whatever, or pass it on to the correct denomination, versus walking that journey with somebody in a way that doesn't take away their autonomy, because a big piece of abuse is losing your autonomy. So then if you go and talk to somebody and they go, right, these are all the things we're now going to do, it feels like abuse again to a victim, because their autonomy is being taken away. So it's being able to walk that path, very carefully. It's a tricky one. It is a tricky one. And then you have the ones who don't want to, because if, for example, like you say, and I've watched some of your stuff around Scientology and the things you shared, some of the situations I've been in, they don't want to have safeguarding being robust, because then they're going to get discovered, right? So then you're talking about a completely different thing.
Yeah, absolutely. Danielle Chamberlain here is in the chat with some great comments. Safeguarding must be enforced in schools, churches, businesses, old folks' homes, and especially cults. And then continues.
Absolutely.
Scientology would stage scenes when social services would do inspections. The spokespeople would be chosen by the leaders, and the people being abused would never be allowed anywhere near the inspectors. And I think that's one thing to note, is this isn't specific to Scientology. This is all cults, right? If there is
100%.
If there's a systemic issue of abuse, or some sort of manipulation or deception or control coercively that's being implemented, and it's a part of the organization itself, then quite often with that you get a cover-up culture as well. And in Scientology you have all these policies that lay out specifically, it actually makes you're forbidden from speaking to law enforcement if you're a Scientologist, and there are policies of what to do if an inspector of some kind, whether it's the police or social services or anyone like that, shows up at a Scientology property. The receptionist has to immediately call the PR spokesperson, and they are the only person that's allowed to speak to that person, and they have to completely craft and manage that relationship so that the inspection doesn't find anything, whether or not anything actually is happening. And it's really carefully crafted. So it's important for, on the flip side, social services, the police and so on, to understand how these cults work so that they don't get duped by these tactics. Would you agree?
100%. And I completely agree. And I want to be really clear. I'm not saying that it means it's okay to not report. I'm just saying when you have got an adult victim, there is a line to be trod in terms of taking them on the journey. However, mandatory reporting, I think, is really, really important. And absolutely, anywhere that has a role of care, that has to include proper, robust safeguarding reporting, etc., etc. And some of that, particularly when it's an adult, can be anonymized. It can be anonymized. Like as an adult, you've got sort of rights around that as well. But also that these, leaders can, for example, get in touch with their local safeguarding and ask for advice about the best way forward. There's the NSPCC adult helpline that you can phone up for advice about the best way forward. And I think a really important part of it as well is helping a victim to navigate that journey and not feel intimidated by it. And so, that's really a big part of it as well. You can't just run ahead as the expert and do all the things, or, as the person who's the safeguarding lead. You have to bring the victim along with you, because as I said, they've lost their autonomy once before. So seeking advice isn't the same as actually reporting, but you'll get help and guidance about the best way to do it.
Right. And I think
that's important.
Yeah, 100%. And I agree with you. Mandated reporting is a very new thing in the UK, and it's still in the process of being implemented, if I understand that correctly, right? Especially with religious groups, yeah? And Jordan spoke last week about how, for example, some religious groups have set up their own supposedly independent watchdogs that look out for safeguarding. And, there was a bit of a conversation around questioning that, of like, okay, it sounds like you're doing the right thing, and it's great that you're paying attention to this issue. But if you're running the organization that deals with safeguarding, can you truly be accountable and independent and unbiased? And he proposed the idea of having some sort of regulator that is independent completely, that any sort of referral can go towards, that would review claims of safeguarding in any religious group, and they would have the autonomy to go and inspect and investigate. What are your thoughts on that?
I think that's incredibly sensible. There are safeguarding professionals who are part of these things that are set up, who, just because they're part of that religious organization, it doesn't mean that they're not going to be completely unbiased. Some people are able to do that and kind of go, it doesn't matter that I belong, this stuff still needs sorting out. But you can't rely on that being the case throughout an organization. And so I completely agree that there needs to be something separate, 100%. I mean, an example of that, slightly different context, but just in terms of how that stuff works. When I was working in anti-human trafficking, I was what's called a first responder for the National Referral Mechanism. And so my role within that was to interview potential victims of human trafficking, write up all the notes, get their whole life story, figure out how they ended up in that situation. But I wasn't the decision maker as to whether they were a genuine victim. I then wrote the notes up, and that went to the government central point that would then make the decision and put them into the National Referral Mechanism or not, and get them the support they needed and all the rest of it. Because if I've done my job really, really well, and we were all very carefully trained, I knew what I was looking for. I knew the right questions to ask. I knew the information that I needed. But when you're sat with someone who is broken and heartbroken and scared and all those things, it's difficult to make an actual decision on the bare-faced facts.
Mhm.
So I then sent the information and the decision was made. And I think that was super, super important, because I could have just been really swayed by my empathy,
Mhm.
but actually the facts might not have added up.
Yeah.
So I think that's a real case in point. Do you know what I mean? That's done really, really well. And I just think you always need someone outside who's got the emotion taken out of it.
Mm. Did you ever come across any, during your time in anti-human trafficking, did you come across any cases of human trafficking in spiritual groups? Because
Yeah.
the reason I ask is, and I know you probably can't give specifics about certain cases you've worked on, but you know, as a wider context type question, because I often think, you know, when you hear about these statistics and the government talking about human trafficking and, you know, the numbers of how many people have been victims of human trafficking, I think there is such a big gap in that. For example, Scientology. You know, I will refer to Scientology a lot during this conversation because
Fair.
that's
That's
my
your,
experience. So that's the
yeah,
only thing I can
absolutely.
draw on. But you know, if you sign your SEAL contract, which is a 1 billion year commitment dedicating
Yes,
your
I've heard about
eternity
that.
to
That's
working for the
crazy.
church, right? You can be moved at any point to
Hmm.
any country and you have to go, right?
Yeah.
Now, Scientology, as a supposedly religious group, have the authority to supply religious worker visas here in the UK and in the US.
Hmm.
And it doesn't matter if you know, there's one person that I remember from my time at working in London, there was a staff member whose husband was based in a different country in Europe, and they hadn't seen each other in 5 or 6 years,
Hmm.
because their commitment is towards the church and they have to do what they're told and go where they're told to go. It doesn't, like, a relationship or a family is second to that, if not third. So if you're told to move country, you've got 24 hours to do it, you have to do it. And for me, that is modern slavery, right? You are
Yeah.
being paid £50 a week to work 7 days a week with no time off. And so there are
Yeah.
definitely, without a doubt, victims of human trafficking in Scientology, but I can almost
Yeah.
certainly guarantee that not a single one of those cases is included in the government statistics and research into human trafficking
No, they
because
won't.
it's
They
just
won't
not
have
on their
been.
radar.
Exactly. The thing with any of these kinds of stats is that they are stats of what is known.
Mm,
And, you know, anything to do with trafficking, even when you talk about what's classically understood as trafficking now, you know, and, you know, the things that are really well understood, those numbers are still well below the actual figures, because until these people are found, there can't be a stat. Do you know what I mean? Like it no stat gives the full answer.
yeah.
Um, you know, you go down, say, sexual abuse or rape, and you'll get stats for that, and you'll think, I probably know. Most people will know someone who's experienced some kind of sexual violence, sexual abuse, rape, and not reported it.
Mm,
So that's not part of the stats. And so it makes sense that this whole thing with the Scientology kind of way of doing things isn't recorded,
mm,
because how many people really get out of Scientology and then really are able to, you know, but absolutely that's trafficking, because they're
yeah.
being moved probably against their will. They've been coerced, or, um, you know, power and authority has made them go places that perhaps they wanted to go. And I would say that there's even a question, even if they say they want to, as to how much they've already been brainwashed. Is it really in part of their will, or
Mhm,
have they been sucked into what they've been taught is right and wrong?
mm,
So it
yeah.
becomes even more complicated. You've got the people who are going, but they know they don't want to, and then the people who think they want to, and the people who
Mhm,
genuinely want to.
yeah. Absolutely.
So it
And
gets
how,
really confusing.
yeah, and how do those, like, government authorities and agencies and so on go about locating victims of trafficking and such like that? You know, because we talked about there being a disconnect between Scientology and the authorities, and yes, there's an element of the more people that report it, the more it will get on people's radar. But you know, is there a government agency that's job it is to locate victims of human
I
trafficking?
mean,
Like, how does
there
that
are
work?
there are human trafficking units within the police, etc., and
Right.
so that's I think that the name has changed and they've become, it depends on which police force you're talking about. I've not been directly working in anti-human trafficking for a good time now, good amount of time, but there is a definite kind of understanding. And I think that the whole knowledge has grown, so they know where to look for these things. So they know to look at, say, these farms where there's loads of people picking fruit or whatever. They know that nail bars are a classic place. They know that if you look at people in the sex industry, if you go to brothels and places like that, you're going to find trafficked people. They know that car washes are a classic one as well. They know that within the building industry, within the farming industry. So there's an awareness of those places to look. And when I was working in anti-human trafficking, for example, I used to be part of a group that would go out and go to the phone boxes around central London and collect all the cards of the sex workers, and then sort of set them out into groups and sets and stuff. And the police, because the police were part of that, like we were working with the police to do this, we were like the hands and feet, were then working through their kind of knowledge base and tracking and all that kind of thing. So, there is knowledge, there's growing knowledge, there's understanding. There are organisations that do a lot of actual database tracking, all the stuff that I don't understand in technology, where you can kind of collate information. So there's been a really, really big growth in understanding and where to look for it, but it doesn't cover everything. And I think that the spiritual abuse and cult side of things is kind of bringing up the rear in terms of what people really understand. And there's also this thing of, I don't want to offend people and their faith. I can't offend a particular culture. And that's where, all of us, particularly who are involved in the National Working Group, have the whole challenging the behaviour, not the belief, strapline, which I think is really, really perfect. But there's a lot of not understanding what the signs are, because they're different to abuse as we recognise it. It's very, very complicated. I think there's an awful lot of learning that still needs to happen, a massive amount. There's a massive amount around trafficking. I mean, I worked, I was delivering training, so we would deliver training to magistrates who'd, convicted somebody, and then after the training gone, oh my gosh, actually they'd been trafficked and forced to do this illegal thing. Do you know what I mean? So there were things like that. We would train police teams. I went and I had a really funny one where I trained about 100 vicars.
Wow.
This whole parish, like this whole bunch of vicars came, and like lay readers and all kinds of things. And I did this whole training day on anti-human trafficking for churches, because these people are everywhere. And so, but I think the spiritual abuse bit underneath it all, as the driver of some of these things, or the means and manner of control, aren't fully understood. Now, when I was in anti-human trafficking, that's really when I first learned about it, despite the fact that I'd gone through spiritual abuse before that myself, because I had training on how juju and witchcraft is used to manipulate and control people. So that's coming out of one particular continent, mostly out of Africa. And that was, a big piece of training that I went on and learnt from, and sort of understanding how that worked. But there's just still so much to learn.
Yeah. And greater awareness needed on these issues. I mean, even if you take something like spiritual abuse or ritual abuse, like that is such a broad topic. And although, for example, the mechanisms, the techniques and the control that Scientology use are very similar to the techniques and mechanisms that are used in, the Jehovah's Witnesses or the Mormon Church or any other cult for that matter, there's a lot of nuance in every single one of those. And so it's such a big topic. And in order to educate the people that need to know about it, that's why training like the training that you are delivering with Jordan is so vitally important, because they need to really have a broader understanding of the whole thing as a topic, right?
100%. I think I had a really intelligent thought there for a second. Nope, it's gone. It will come back. It was two things I wanted to say. Firstly, the other thing for me is that when we talk about spiritual and ritual abuse, we often focus in on like the bigger, more dramatic stories.
Mm.
and which I'm not making light of. So the obvious ones like Scientology, or all these different ones people have escaped from, Jehovah's Witnesses, etc., etc. And that's really important. And I think it's really important because some of it sounds so insane and crazy that people are like, that's ridiculous, that can't be real.
I've had that
Like,
exact response
yeah,
from police officers before with
right,
Scientology.
exactly. It's
There's
like,
no way they're doing all of that, because that
right,
just sounds
exactly.
so far-fetched. And it's like, no, like,
It's
it
so Hollywood
really is
blockbuster,
happening.
isn't it? It's so
Yeah.
Hollywood blockbuster. It's like there's no way.
Yeah.
Whereas I'm now of the opinion that the more crazy it sounds, the more likely it's to be real. Because who comes out with this stuff if they, do you know what I mean? Like, why would you make that? But on the flip side, we can't focus on that and forget the lower level spiritual abuse that can be incredibly devastating
Mm.
within faith groups that aren't cults as such, but the sort of the power abuses and the spiritual sort of abuse elements are there and can be incredibly destructive.
Mm.
Um, and we mustn't forget that end of it as well. Almost, it's so low level that you're probably, I mean, the phrase that a lot of people use around stuff that happens in churches is church hurt. And it's like, we don't say work hurt when you're bullied at work. We
Yeah.
don't say like husband hurt when you're married to someone who's abusive, or wife hurt, or whatever.
Mm.
It seems to only be used in the context of church hurt, because it's almost in this context of, well, you've been hurt, but you need to be forgiving.
It's just
And actually,
disgusting.
it's
Yeah.
abusive, right?
Yeah.
But do you understand what I'm saying? And we mustn't. It's almost like we really need to believe the really crazy shit that goes down,
Mm.
but we mustn't therefore then go, well, that's so low level that you're probably exaggerating how much it's actually broken you or hurt you.
Mm.
That we have to have all of it. We have to be aware of all of it.
Yeah.
So that was one thing that I wanted to kind of
Yeah.
put in there. And then there was something else I was going to say, and now that's gone, which was the question you asked me. So
It's okay. It'll come back. I wanted
it'll
to
come
ask
back.
about I wanted to ask about your personal experience, and feel free
Mhm.
if you don't want to delve into it. But you mentioned that you had a personal experience of dealing with spiritual and ritual abuse, and I guess my question is, like, is that what spurred you on to trying to work in safeguarding and starting to deliver this training, is from your own personal experience, or was it something else?
I think so. My journey into it's been a little bit more kind of, oh, this is what I'm doing now. Then is it okay? Well, that I can bring all of my experience into that.
Right.
Wow. Okay, that kind of um, gives a purpose for what I've been through. Not that I was put through it in order to do this. And in my faith in God, I don't go, well, God allowed me to go through this stuff so that I can then. It can sound like you're playing semantics, but it's more like you've gone through this different stuff, and now that you're finding some purpose in it,
Hmm.
which can feel quite heat. Do you know what I mean? It's the other way around. It's not like God planned you to go through crap so that you would then rest, because then that becomes a crazy kind of circular thing of like, so all the people I'm helping are going through it to help other people who are going through it. That doesn't make any sense, right?
Right.
So I would say that I really understand a path that I've been on that's led me to be able to do this. But my own experience was the church that I went to when I got married. So I married this guy. He was one of the pastors. The church was an independent church, which essentially meant that there was no real authority. There was no checks and balances, but they were part of kind of the local area group of churches, and everyone knew everybody, and like the senior pastor knew everybody, and he kind of led the local group of churches a lot. Do you know what I mean? So you kind of felt safe. I married the youth pastor. He was well known for doing like kids work, and it all seemed quite legit. But actually, the church was very patriarchal. Um, it was an eldership. Women couldn't be in those positions of leadership. My vows were that I had to say obey in my vows. And I recognize now that I was being very controlled and manipulated. It was abusive. I completely lost myself in it. The senior pastor backed all of that up. I ended up working for free for the church as an elder's wife, so I did a lot of, youth kids ministry stuff. And you know, you're kind of gaslit into what's normal, because it was kind of like, no, he's just very passionate, like the overall leader, because he's very shouty and very controlling. He would do things like have conversations with me and be like, a lot of people find you intimidating, but I know your real heart, because I'm half Italian and a bit loud, right? So it's just like, I'm not intimidating. I'm probably operating out of actually feeling quite scared and hurt, because I don't understand why this isn't going the way it should be going.
Mm.
Very rejected by my husband a lot of the time. Very much like you have to be obedient, and kind of just losing myself. And I don't want to go into kind of real details about what the marriage was like, but
Of course.
you know, it was very controlling, very much lost myself. You know, there was a real sense of, because my family aren't Christians. My dad's Italian, so he's Catholic by birth and upbringing, but I sort of had quite a conversion experience in my teens and got involved, and really, my mum was always like, I don't understand how this happened, because I'm not a churchgoer.
Sure.
And so there was this kind of like, you can't really talk to your family about this because they're not Christians, so they don't understand. You know, that kind of attitude, and kind of that classic pulling away from the
It's
people who would.
isolation, isn't it?
Right,
It's putting you in a
100%.
situation where you have no one to turn to except
Right.
for the church, which we
Because
see
those
time
other
and
people
time
won't
again.
understand. Those
Yeah.
other people won't understand, right? I have one of my closest friends, who I met when I was 18. She was 17. She's from Hungary, and she was doing a gap year over here, and we met, and we've been friends ever since. And when her and her husband came over for my wedding, and when my husband and I split up, and I phoned her to tell her, it was only a couple of weeks after it happened, so I was still broken and still like, oh my gosh, how am I going to live without my husband? Because you're kind of trained to think that you're a failure, and it's all your fault, and you're a crap wife, and you know, you're some kind of disaster as a Christian, because, you know, divorce is bad and all of those things. I phoned her up, and she literally said to me, now her and her family, the only people in the world who are allowed to call me Gabby, right? So just put that out there. Because when I was a teenager, that's what I was called. And so they've been allowed to keep doing that. And she literally said to me, when I came over for your wedding, I could see already that he had complete control of you, and there was nothing I could do about it. And I've been praying for you ever since. We finally split up after about 5 or 6 years. And she said, I know you're broken and hurt, but I can hear in your voice that my old Gabby's coming back. And that was within a couple of weeks. She had been able to completely see it. And my family saw me change, and there was nothing they could do. I think my family were a bit like, well, he is like a minister, so hopefully, even though we don't much like him, he's going to treat her okay. And then I had this whole thing of not telling them what was going on, because I didn't want them to think badly of my faith. And there's a whole bunch of stuff around that. But I got, you know, when we split up, I got preached against by the senior pastor. Other people told me. He told people that my family were controlling, that I was a complete disaster because I'd been ill when we were married, and so I'd made my husband's life hell because I'd been ill. I had ME for a number of years, so you know. So there's all these different things, and I mean, even to the point where the senior pastor, I parked outside a friend's house after everything had happened, and I had the laptop that belonged to an organisation that we partnered with, and the senior pastor had been in the house. He came flying out and was yelling and screaming at me through the window of my car that I should give the laptop back. I was like, I've already been in touch with the actual organisation. I want you to come before the elders because we need to talk to you about your behaviour, and blah, blah, like demanding that I go before the elders. I mean, I was covered in his spit as he was yelling through the window as well. And I shut the window, and he's hammering on the car and like screaming through the car at me. I walked away one time when things were going wrong with my ex-husband, and we'd had to go to the pastor for counselling because he knew what he was doing with counselling, not. And I'd gone forward for prayer in church, and the senior pastor had grabbed me and I was trying to get away because I could feel I was going to start crying, and I was trying to keep it all very low key because I was told that nobody in church should know that we were having difficulties and all that stuff. And he was literally hanging onto my wrist and saying through gritted teeth, "You will stand here and let me pray over you," and kind of smiling out to the congregation. And then at the end of service, he totally tore me off the strip for embarrassing him in front of his children because I'd been so obviously disobedient. When I came away, and I had bruising on my wrist from it. But there was so much fear because you're made to believe that they have so much more power than they really do, because you're in that organization, you're in that congregation. He's the senior pastor, your husband is one of the elders, and everyone thinks they're kind of wonderful. And then you're kind of painted as this nut job who has made the poor husband's life hell because you're so over emotional. And that plays into the neurodiversity piece, and kind of just how, as someone who's neurodivergent, I've spent most of my life trying to fit in, and feeling like I'm too much anyway. And so this messaging is being redoubled, and so the whole thing just becomes completely crazy. And actually, you don't realize that you've given them that power. You can walk away, but I was terrified, absolutely terrified. And this was a church in the high street kind of thing, that loads of other people knew about, deeply involved in national conference work, with lots of other denominations and everything else. But behind it all, it was horrific. And as I stepped away, there were other people who'd gone who had been totally bad-mouthed, and you were made to think that they were a total nightmare. And then you realised you were one of those total nightmares, because actually you're just going, I can't deal with this anymore. So, I mean, I had one of the elders who had joined, his wife, they were kind of trying to tell me to ignore it because they had a horrific time there. And they were almost kind of trying to tell me that the senior pastor and my husband were both in the wrong, but they were scared to say anything because they were, do you know what I mean? It was just nuts. It was completely nuts. And you walk away going, did I really do all of that and go through all of that? Like, I didn't grow up in any of this stuff. And yet I still ended up deeply embroiled in it. And that was only after like 5 or 6 years. And it's taken a long time to unpick all of that.
Absolutely. And that's one thing that I think people really need to understand, is that when it comes to abuse of any kind, whether it be SA, or whether it be ritual abuse, or whether it be a cult, or domestic, whatever, it quite often takes a very long time to even recognize that what happened to you could be seen as abuse, and it takes an even longer time to come to terms with it and get yourself in a position where you feel comfortable reporting it to somebody. So those challenges need to be understood when it comes to safeguarding. Like, how can you, from a safeguarding perspective, like how do you safeguard people like that, who are too afraid to come forward, who are perhaps being abused by somebody in a religious group, and that person should be reporting, yes, but isn't reporting? Like, how do you navigate that from a safeguarding perspective?
I think that as someone who's as a safeguarding person, I can't hold myself responsible for whether someone chooses to disclose or not, right? I can't make people disclose, but I can create a culture or show a persona of someone who will believe you. Even, and I think that's the thing. I don't really believe in safe spaces anymore, which probably sounds incredibly negative. I believe that spaces can be safer than other spaces, but nowhere can be 100% safe, because you can't legislate for every single person in that space, right? But I think we can have braver spaces, and I think we can have honest spaces, and I think we can have spaces where people are believed and welcomed and accepted. And the safest spaces are the ones who acknowledge that they can't be 100% safe, but we'll deal with stuff when we get it wrong. Do you see what I mean? So
Yeah.
it's not as negative as it sounds, because otherwise, why am I even doing safeguarding work if I think nowhere can ever be safe? But I think that's really, really important. And so none of us can be responsible for making other people disclose,
Mm.
but we can offer the kind of culture that people feel that they can.
Yeah.
And they're not going to be judged or rejected or thought of as stupid, or the opportunity gets, lost because of someone's reaction. And I
Mm.
think that's the most we can do. And so knowledge is everything,
Mm-hmm.
in one way or another. And the other thing, that whole thing of like, I can't remember the saying properly, but that whole thing, when I was a child, I thought my parents knew everything. When I was a teenager, I thought they knew nothing and I knew everything. Now I'm an adult and I realize that,
Nobody knows anything.
nobody knows. So we're all making it up, right?
Yeah.
Like, you're more intelligent if you can acknowledge that actually you don't know much and you're always on a journey of learning.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so cultures, organizations, places, groups, faith groups, whoever you're talking about, who can have this culture of curiosity and honesty, and not immediately taking offense when someone's genuinely asking because they want to learn,
Mm.
and trying to create those kind of spaces, then you're laying the groundwork for where people can disclose,
Yeah.
for where these things can be looked at, for where these conversations can happen. And
Sure.
the other thing is, I'm a safeguarding expert, but I don't know everything about
Mm.
safeguarding. And I can bet your life, if you tried even the tiniest bit, you'd be able to find questions that I wouldn't have answers for.
Mm.
And I have to be absolutely okay with that, which I am, because then I'm like, oh no, I'm not sure about that, I'll go and find out and let you know. Or, but I know someone who probably has that answer because I know this.
Mm.
And so the other thing is that I have to call myself an expert in a professional sense, but we can't be experts. We can be experts in a certain amount, and then we call on other people. So safeguarding can never be done on your own.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's really important as well. So I think being able to turn around and say, my gosh, that sounds like that's really big. I believe you. I'm sorry you've gone through that. I don't understand it. I need to now get some advice for that area. All of those things make a much better space for people to be able to,
Yeah. And greater understanding as well. Like you mentioned at the beginning about, in order to properly safeguard someone, you need to understand all of the factors that are at play there: LGBTQ plus, disability, neurodivergency, spiritual and ritual abuse. Because unless you understand all of those things, you can't fully safeguard someone. And I wanted to tailor that in towards that neurodiversity piece that you mentioned before, because neurodiversity, I can't remember if it was a national working group that you said this, or whether it was in a meeting we had afterwards, but you mentioned that neurodiverse people can be actually more vulnerable to spiritual and ritual abuse. And I wondered if you could expand on that. Why and how does that come about?
I mean, there are stats all over the place for it, apart from anything else. One stat that's kind of out there was that one study found that 90% of autistic women are victims of sexual assault, versus what they reckon about 30% of women in the general population. So the thing with the neurodiversity piece is that for myself and the majority, all the neurodivergent people that I speak to or have relationship with, friendship with, we've grown up with this sense of not properly belonging. We don't quite fit into the world as it's been set up now. I could be very, very autistic and go down an entire, this is my special interest, and we could be here for hours, which I won't do. But from the Industrial Revolution screwed it for us in many, many ways, because we got set up with this system of, the working system and kind of 9 to 5 and business hours and industry and all the things that kind of sensory overload us and all kinds of stuff. Right? There's a whole bunch of stuff. And that's for all different neurodivergent conditions and situations. But I grew up feeling not quite like I belonged. I was bullied most of the way through school. I could never understand why. And I think a lot of our experience is like, I said the funny thing and no one laughed. They said the funny thing and everyone did. when they get upset, everyone rushes to their side. When I get upset, everyone's like, all right, calm down, chill out, you're too much, blah, 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 blah. And we can't figure out why. And so you're almost searching for a belonging that is difficult to have. You've always felt a bit like a fish out of water. Anyway, there's something not clicking. There's something that's, and I was always, I've got, friends from, say, my secondary school who I'm still friends with now, but I can remember having conversations around the dining table at lunchtime and then going, oh gosh, you always go so deep. Why do you always do it so seriously? And now I'm like, oh, I'm bloody autistic and I can't be bothered with small talk. But I didn't understand that at the time. I was just like, oh, it's me again being a complete pain in the butt. Do you know what I mean? I'm too much. The message is I'm too much. Then you arrive in a faith group that welcomes you. And it's like, finally, somewhere I'm going to belong. And it's like, it's a church, it's a whatever. If they can't love me, then I really am useless, right? Do you know what I mean? Because that's what they're supposed to do. And also, I mean, I'm autistic and ADHD, but the autistic bit of me craves like rules that I can really understand, because there is so much unwritten rules in everyday life. A very basic, simple, slightly whatever thing. People go, oh, how are you? Well, I want to answer, but actually it's just a greeting, right? But how does everyone know that?
Yeah.
It's these
I think
unwritten rules of how you interact
linking that,
and all that kind of thing, right?
yeah, and linking that specifically to Scientology, right? Like, I can totally see how Scientology itself is can really appeal to neurodivergent people, because, like, for example,
Yeah,
there's one of the first most basic courses you do in Scientology is called the communication course. And it basically says, hey, look, everybody knows how to communicate, but are you ever actually taught how to communicate? No. So we're going to actually teach you this
wow.
formula on how communication works, right? And it breaks it down in a very basic level of like, okay, so you say something and then you acknowledge it and you respond. And like, it has a whole formula of how
Oh my
communication is meant to
word.
work. And I can
And
see
all of the
exactly how
neurodivergent
this,
people out there are going, yeah, all the neurodivergent people out there are going, where's the blooming handbook that none of us were given, but everyone seems to know about?
and this is basically what
There
it
it
is,
is.
right? There
Yeah,
it is.
yeah,
And on top of that, you have the love bombing and the gaslighting and the kind of
yeah,
making you feel special. And, especially in Scientology, the whole way the organization is run is rules and regulations, right? It's like,
yeah,
if you apply policy correctly, it will work 100% of the time. So you have to follow the rules.
yeah,
And if it doesn't work, it's because you haven't followed the rules properly.
yeah,
And I can
yeah.
totally see how that would make
Right.
someone who is, neurodiverse in some way, it can make them feel accepted and understood,
Mhm.
and it can appeal to them, but actually it
We
makes
know
it
what we're
even more
doing.
dangerous for those people.
Yes, we know what we're doing. So the autistic part of me was right for being told what to do. And, I'm not totally dismissing my conversion experience, because I still believe that was of God and stuff. And other people don't. And everyone has their own kind of journey in that. And that's fine. For me, that was still God. But how that was picked up is another thing. And so the autistic part of me that was like, I just don't understand why I don't fit in. And then they go, well, this is how you fit in. These are the parameters that you can live in. And then I suppose the ADHD part of me that wants the dopamine hit, it's all the excitement of like changing the world and doing stuff for Jesus, and I'm going to save souls, and and there's all this exciting stuff as well. So you've got both covered there, right? You've got,
Mhm.
it's all there, it's all happening. And then we're taught, and this applies to other people who are vulnerable, perhaps because of abusive situations as they were growing up as well, and they're looking to fit in. There's a whole other interesting piece around neurodiversity, mental health, and trauma, and how a lot of what people think are the outworkings of neurodiversity are actually trauma responses because of being neurodivergent in a non-typical world. So people go, well, like autistic people will have meltdowns. You'll see kids having meltdowns and adults have meltdowns as well. I'm like, yeah, but that's a trauma response, because I might have a meltdown if I've spent the whole day under bright lights in the city, loads, all the stuff that's caused a sensory overload. I'm not going to have a meltdown if I'm sat in my garden and nothing's
Mhm.
bothering me, right? Do you see what I mean? So there is some of that as well, and so there's links and confusion and complications around all of that. So some of this also, it applies directly to anyone who's vulnerable as well, of this needing to belong. And so you're in there, and then they're going, God loves you, sacrifice yourself, these are the rules, this is how you belong. And then you're having these amazing experiences, saying worship or being loved and cared for, like really experiencing God, or prophetic ministry, or, you know, given prophetic words that tell you the direction of your life, for example. And you're going to go, well, now I know what I'm doing. Like, it's all becoming a lot easier. And so that's how you get pulled in. And then the cognitive dissonance is completely insane, because you're taught to gaslight yourself a little bit, or quite a lot, as a neurodivergent person anyway. And that's not done on purpose. I'm not talking about, like, my parents didn't do that particularly, but there would be times where it would be like, you really feel things deeply, maybe it'd be better if you didn't take everything to heart in quite that way, then you wouldn't be so hurt. And that's a perfectly fine thing for a parent to try and help a child to do. However, you inculcate it differently if you're neurodivergent. You're going, I'm too much, blah, 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 blah. And so you're taught to gaslight yourself a bit anyway, because you're always kind of going, I'm getting it wrong, I must be the rubbish one, I'm not very good, all that kind of thing. There's a whole, what's called the double empathy problem, which is that neurodivergent people spend their whole time going, I have to understand the neurotypical world, but neurotypical people don't necessarily feel like they have to understand the neurodivergent world. And so there's all of that going on. And then you join this, you join a church or wherever, and then there's this whole, you must have grace, you must be forgiving, you mustn't be angry, blah, blah, blah. And all of it just piles in, and you're kind of going, I don't know who I am anymore. But this kind of autonomous, like, I'm kind of automatically trying to follow these things. I'm trying to suppress the emotions that are too big, because that shows a lack of faith. I mustn't get angry, which is rubbish, because Jesus turned the tables over in the temples. And anger, there's nothing wrong with any emotion, it's what you do with it. So a bit of table turning rather than murdering someone is totally cool, right? So you've got all of that stuff going on, and then you completely lose yourself, and then you don't know what's up, what's down. All you know is you're probably getting it wrong, and you need to keep improving, because you're letting the side down, or you're not being an obedient enough wife, or you're not being gentle enough as a elder's wife, or you're not. Do you know what I mean? You're everyone thinks you're aggressive or intimidating. You're like, no, I'm just half Italian. Like, calm down. And all of that mixes in, and then you're trapped. You're caught.
Yeah.
And it's a mess.
What do you think needs to be done in order to, because, for example, we talked there about the communication course and Scientology, and how it can be used, how it can appeal to neurodiverse people, and how it can be used to manipulate and harm people who are perhaps more vulnerable to that. I didn't notice that or understand that about Scientology until I'd had a conversation with a friend who is an expert on autism and ADHD, and also understands a bit of Scientology, and pointed out, no, look, this, have you not noticed how many ex-Scientologists that who are on the spectrum, or who are neurodiverse in some way? There's a reason it appeals to people like that. And I reckon there are a lot of people who are neurodiverse in Scientology, or other cults as well, let's not forget, who don't even recognize it and don't realize it, but they are more vulnerable to these things, and therefore they don't realize that perhaps they're being abused or harmed in some way. And the cultic group isn't going to do anything to safeguard them, because actually it benefits them to have more vulnerable people in. So what can be done to safeguard particularly neurodiverse people from ritual cultic abuse, if there can be anything? There may not be an answer, but
I think that again, it's more knowledge is power, isn't it? Just like I said, you can't force somebody, you can't be responsible as to whether someone discloses or not. You can only provide the best setting for it. There are so many threads to this that we can't control all of them. I think in general we're kind of moving in the right direction, because we've had, in the 80s, 70s, when I was growing up, who even knew what safeguarding meant, right? It just wasn't really a thing. I mean, there was some stuff when it was really extreme, but it wasn't, previous to that, like domestic abuse, it was just a domestic, so the police wouldn't step in, and now it's totally, illegal, dealt with, or whatever. So safeguarding really kind of took hold and it became a topic. There's been a lot around it. We're still learning. There's still mistakes made. But that's happened. The mental health piece came in, and it's become more and more easy to talk about your mental health. You have mental health in the workplace, first aid mental health training, all those things. Mental health has become a much more embedded, easier topic. Not done well everywhere, but it's there. The next one that's been coming up has been neurodiversity. And I would say last year was probably quite a big explosion in terms of neurodiversity in the workplace and all of these things kind of really coming to the fore a lot more. And so they're all gradually embedding in different ways. The spiritual and ritual abuse stuff, there's a lot more learning around that. And it's almost like we have to just hope we're on the right trajectory for these things to be understood, you know, trauma-informed stuff. There's so much about things coming out. So it used to be, oh, it's just that, you know, priests in the Catholic Church was the big thing. And then it was like, actually, the laundries that the nuns used to run for the girls who were pregnant and the abuses that went on there. And now there's been so much come out in the Church of England, and then there's been so much. And so it's all gradually coming out. And my hope is that we get to a point where it's all out and it's all there for the taking in terms of people believing it, understanding it, and having knowledge of it. Mm-hmm. I don't think I could sit here and come up with solutions that would answer all of it, because there's so many things that have to happen. But those things are happening gradually, too slowly, but they're happening. Do you know what I mean? There's just so many threads to it all.
Yeah, and I think it comes down to like those core principles of education, understanding, right? The greater understanding there is, and the more educated people are, the better we're going to be able to safeguard people. And at the moment, you know, like when we're talking about how do you, you know, report, how do you get someone who's being a victim of, you know, SA or human trafficking or whatever in the Sea Org and Scientology, like a lot of organizations wouldn't even think to look at Scientology as a place where those things could happen. So the more we educate those people that, no, this is what you need to look out for, and this is why it may be happening here, the better. And also, Selena here has mentioned community, right? Community is such a valuable resource. And, you know, she asked here, was that me? Yes, it was you, Selena, the person that was talking to me about Scientology and neurodivergency. It was you. Yeah, neurodivergency. Yeah, like the community is a really valuable resource for people who are
100%.
Going through this.
It's got, and because we, you know, we can't say the police has to deal with it all, the government has to deal with it all. It really does boil down to your actual community. Those places, you know, where we feel safer, where we feel included, inclusive spaces, brave spaces, honest spaces who are willing to, you know, walk, you know, that journey with somebody. We can't just always blame it on, you know, laws and police and stuff. That all has to be robustly in place. But in your everyday life, it's got to be the communities that you're involved in. And my kind of walk to freedom didn't come initially from a faith group. It came from an autism support group for families who have autistic daughters. Just to be completely like totally different, because my godchild is autistic, and so I started going to those to learn to be a better godmother, and then started going, shit, that's me, and recognizing my autism. I've been part of that community now for 9 years, and as that started to unpick, it then helped me to start unpicking. I mean, I knew about the spiritual abuse because I'd left the marriage and everything, but then the church that I went to after that, I've now been working through some stuff and realised I was still quite manipulated there. And it was that much what you would say lower level compared to, say, Scientology. But I didn't recognise it because it was far better than the one I'd escaped from, right?
But it's still abuse. Like, that's the thing. There's no comparison, right? It's like abuse is abuse.
For me, I was like, this feels so much safer.
Yeah.
It must be okay. So I was still working that. So as I started unpacking my neurodiversity and understanding all that, then going into therapy, I've then been able to go, actually, even the church I was in until fairly recently was not safe. It's a Church of England church, right? But there's, you know, there's stuff gone down there. And now I'm in a little tiny, it's a very small church that meets in someone's home, full of neurodivergent people, LGBT people, like all the people from the margins who are the best people,
Mm,
quite honestly. And it's very, nobody tells anyone what to do. We just explore and discover together. It is that brave space that I'm talking about.
mm,
But it is the communities that I was in that made me feel supported,
mm,
and then safe enough to kind of go, what is my voice? Oh, I've got a bit more of a voice now. Oh, I actually, you know, if you told me 3 years ago I'd come on a live and share everything that I've just shared today, absolutely not. I'm still working through it, and that's still a lot to share publicly. Now I'm like, yeah, cool. You know, I've shared it because I've gradually grown in being secure because of the communities that I've been in
mm.
that have been incredible.
Well
Um,
done. That makes me so happy, like hearing that, you know, everyone's got their own journey, and hearing the journey that you've been on. I think what's most empowering perhaps is the fact that not only have you gone through your own journey and you've come out the other side and are willing to speak about parts of it publicly, but also you're one of those people that's actually trying to do something to prevent it happening to other people and to educate others, right? And you've used your skill set to help develop this training and to work with Jordan and the spiritual ritual abuse stuff, but bring in safeguarding and also neurodiversity. Like you're the sort of person that's actually thought, hey, look, how can I turn this experience into something positive that can make an effect change? And I think we need more people like that.
well, thank you. That's really kind. I just want to say Jordan's written the training. I'm
But
adding some little
you had
twists
to
and
learn
stuff
it
now.
to deliver it,
Yeah,
right?
and I'm adding in, you know, sort of little bits around the neurodiversity piece and stuff, but it is
Mm,
his training. But there's other training. So there's one that I have again with somebody else who's a mental health expert, looking at safeguarding mental health and neurodiversity in faith groups to make them sort of vibrant communities, um, you know, and kind of actually looking at how those link. So I have training on that. You know, I pull all of that stuff into various different areas, and really wanting to educate people to understand that faith groups are just as important as how to deal with safeguarding in schools.
mhm.
And actually, you need to know all this stuff because in any frontline situation, you are going to have people coming from these things. And that's it. So it is knowledge, it is training, it is good community, it is honesty, it is all of the things we said. And in an ideal world, we wouldn't need labels anymore because we could all just be ourselves. We wouldn't be being gaslit. We wouldn't have people who are so power hungry, but that's like the euphoric kind of distant dream. And, you know, that's never going to be the case. So we have to keep going and getting the messages out there to help people understand what they're dealing with.
Mhm. Yeah, absolutely.
And the work that you're doing, talking about, you know, Scientology and all of the things that you do. And, you know, I've looked at quite a few of your, you know, lives and stuff now, and things that you're doing, working, you know, speaking up at government, speaking truth to power. It's amazing and
Thank you.
incredibly brave. And
But
so
again, it's
more people like that. Do you know what I mean? It's
yeah, but again, it's community, right? Like
mm,
I couldn't do that without the help of other people. And also, the more educated I am in different topics and things, the better and more effective I'm going to be. And
yeah,
that's why it's important to talk about things like neurodiversity, safeguarding, and like every single new person I speak to brings something new to the table
yeah,
that either I didn't know about or did know about but didn't know enough about, or you know, is something that I could improve on or learn more from their personal
mm.
experience. And I think that conversation and community is such an important part of it.
Oh yeah,
And you know, not wanting to call out any in particular police group or police organization or government group, I think there is a real lack of understanding in government about these issues, right?
yeah,
Yes, there's the big policy frameworks and so on, but it's like, well, you know, we shouldn't have a situation where people can slip through the net. And I understand that's a big ask because, you know, in order to have a net that catches people, it needs to be fine tuned, right? But
yeah,
like, it's a process, and we're working through it and we're doing what we can.
yeah,
But I hope that we get to a place one day where everybody who works with children or faith groups or any vulnerable adult or anybody who's vulnerable for that matter,
Yeah.
whether they're neurodivergent, LGBTQ plus, disabled, whatever it may be,
Yeah.
all of those people, anyone who comes in contact with a vulnerable person needs to fully understand all elements of safeguarding. And I won't
Yeah.
rest until that happens. I think that's really important.
I think it's also important to say that the other understanding we have to have is that every single one of us can be vulnerable.
Yes.
It isn't actually just working with the vulnerable people or the people who have all these different things. Every single one of us has the capability or the possibility of ending up being vulnerable for whatever reason. And that's really important. That's like a real humanity thing. It's like we are all in the position that in the blink of an eye something can happen where we're now the vulnerable one.
Yeah.
And that's why safeguarding matters literally everywhere.
Yeah.
That's why understanding these things matters literally everywhere. We have a bit of so I have a business coach, and we sort of talk about one of my things with autism is pattern recognition, and we were talking the other day and talked about how I can almost like someone can say a situation to me that's nothing to do with safeguarding, and I'll find the safeguarding pattern in there, basically. And so I'm actually going to be doing some social media posts around it, because I thought of, have you seen My Big Fat Greek Wedding?
Mm-hmm.
So the bit where the dad talks about give me a word, any word, and I'll tell you the Greek root of it. I'm basically him, but with safeguarding. So I'm going to tell me a situation and I'll find the safeguarding issue in there. So I'm actually going to do a series of posts around that. I'm going to be challenging a few people that I know to give me a situation, and then because it is everywhere in literally everything. It really, really is.
I love it. Look, I'm very aware we are over the time that we had planned
Yeah,
for this. I don't want to eat up too much of our evening. So should we
I'm
go through
I'm
some of these?
happy. I'm happy.
Let's go through some of these questions and comments. There are a bunch of people at the beginning saying hello. So hi, Sue Denham. Thank you so much. Danielle Chamberlain, Selena, all the usual bunch. Haggis Basher is saying good afternoon. Scientology up north from Denmark. That's Miriam. We've got Kirby's mum. So good to see so many familiar faces. Thank you so much for joining.
Some great names on there.
Oh, yeah,
Some of
absolutely.
the names are amazing.
Hans Christian Schwartz here says family is an afterthought in Scientology, and I think that's so true. And I'm not sure if this is the same in the group that you were in, but it certainly is in other cultic groups. The idea that the organization comes first, that's more important than anything else, and that can lead you to not look after yourself sometimes, right? Because you start thinking about the group or the organization before your own personal needs and boundaries.
You're supposed to be so sacrificial all the time. I remember hitting a point and kind of going, do you know what? Everyone goes, oh, you should lay down your life, and you can pull out a Bible verse and say, lay down your life for Jesus, and he must become more and I must become less, and all this kind of stuff. But I remember getting really stuck on Jesus came to give us life in all its fullness. And if life in all its fullness is me driving myself into the ground to persuade the next lot of people to become Christians, it's almost like this kind of multi-level marketing scam of, we'll draw you in with all these promises and then you'll run yourself mad and, getting more people in. And it's this crazy circle. I'm not saying that that is what Christianity is, but I'm saying that that's what a lot of religious groups end up making you feel like doing. And you that comes first. It's showing your faith by putting the organization, the faith group above your family. You're being sacrificial. There's something very kind of, oh, I'm so wonderful because even though I want to be with my family, I've sacrificed it. There's that rhetoric, isn't there, as well? So yeah.
Lisa Terry here says, hi, Alex, Gabrielle, and chat. Thanks, guys. What an amazing chat. Really eye-opening. Thank you so much for opening up. Really brave and inspiring. Want to wrap my arms around all abused. And I want to...
Lisa sounds like my kind of person. I'm like a total hug monster. So yeah, hugs right back at you.
Absolutely. Rachel Harris here says, abuse is such a terrible aspect of modern life. You would think that in 2025, us humans would have this under control. We need to ensure no one is affected by any abuse. And I agree 100%.
Yeah. I do think that there is something about it feeling like it's really gone crazy because actually we talk about it more as well. Do you know what I mean? There are things that have definitely got worse, but there's lots and lots that's always been there. It's just that we can now talk about it. And I think we have to remember that before we kind of collapse under the weight of it's getting worse and worse and worse and worse all the time. But I completely hear that as well. Yeah.
Yeah, I
We
think,
should have it
you know,
sorted by now, right?
yeah, and I think people, you know, without wanting to get too political, but certain political figures over in America made comments about there being more autistic and more ADHD people now than there ever have been, and it's like, well,
Mm,
no, it's not necessarily because there are, you know, there might be more diagnoses, yes, but it's probably actually because we're now in an environment where people are talking about it more, people are recognizing the signs and going to get diagnosed. It's not
it's more
necessarily
than
that there's
that.
been an increase in number of people with it. I
No,
think
no.
that people are just recognizing it more.
Well, the original diagnostic model was from observations of white boys. So the reason why, for example, there's such a huge amount of women getting diagnosed autistic and ADHD is because we mask in a different way, and it was never recognised. We were flying under the radar because the diagnostic model was based on observing white boys. Um, and so that's some of the issue. And what's happened is a bit like what happened with my godchild. They're non-binary, but when they got diagnosed, I then went, oh, hang on a minute, and that's what's happened to a lot of parents, particularly mums, because their daughters are now getting diagnosed. It's better understood, and then they're going, but this is normal. This is just how I am. Oh, hang on, that's why I've struggled as well. And so that's why the diagnostics is because we've increased in understanding.
Yeah.
We've always been there. We've all always been there.
Yeah, absolutely. Um,
So,
Danielle Chamberlain here says, comment, it does make sense to me, but I haven't a clue how an abused Sea Org member will never have opportunity to come forward. Will even have an opportunity to come forward. Even the internet use is monitored. I don't know the answer. And yeah, I agree. I think that with cults specifically, and Scientology being one of them, it's even more nuanced. Like the understanding needs to be even greater because it is so specific. You know, if you're a member of the Sea organization, you're working 7 days a week. You know, you joined as a or were recruited as a child, and your whole family are in Scientology, and now you're working 7 days a week with no time off, 14, 16, 18 hours a day, being paid £50 a week. Firstly, you're not going to know that what you're doing is you know, being a victim of modern slavery or human trafficking, and you're not going to be aware of that because you've not been exposed to the outside world, and
exactly.
you're not going to be given the opportunity to report that to anybody, because if you do, you will be shamed, disconnected, you'll be declared a source of trouble or a suppressive person, you'll lose everything. And so and also the government agencies and police aren't going to know that that's going on, because even if they do go and inspect St. Hill, the UK headquarters,
Yeah,
there will be a massive operation immediately underway to scurry away anybody who's clearly showing signs of any sort of abuse.
yeah,
And you are literally conditioned to lie to these people so that everybody looks the other way. And for me, I think, and you might agree or disagree, Gabriella, but the only way of solving that problem is by educating those who do the inspecting, those who
exactly.
need to enforce safeguarding,
Yeah,
on how it works in Scientology. Because
yeah,
without that understanding, they're not going to be able to help these people.
yeah,
Would you agree?
100%, 100%, because they're going to go in and go, well, it all looks all right.
Yeah.
Um,
They all
and,
seem
and, and
happy.
they, yeah, right. And I think because I watched Jordan's one, and he was talking about the child that first alerted him to
Yeah.
all of this stuff, who was perfectly happy because he'd been brought up thinking that was how things should be.
Mm,
Um, and so there's a lot of work now, particularly sort of in local authority and stuff, around training people in what we call professional curiosity and asking bigger questions than what's just in front of you.
mm,
But for sure, and getting past this thing of being afraid to offend someone's culture, because quite frankly, if you're a totally above board organization, are you really going to be offended if someone's double checking that no one's being abused? No.
Exactly. If you've got
Now
nothing to
there are
hide,
ways to do it. There are
yeah,
ways to do it that don't put people's backs up and all of that kind of thing. But honestly, if it's someone's culture or rescuing someone who's being abused, let's rescue the person who's being abused. But you can do it in a respectful way. But if you don't even know what you're looking for or understand the tricks that are pulled, then you're not going to look for the right signs anyway. And so then you're absolutely, the education is what's fundamental and key. Totally. We
absolutely.
saw that with the bigger understanding of modern slavery and human trafficking, where there was all this kind of, once you see it, you can't unsee it. And when I started working in human trafficking, I'd be walking around going, well, that person looks like they've been trafficked, and I know I wasn't making it up. I wasn't. But it's almost like you're given a lens to look through that reveals everything in a way that you hadn't seen before. And I think that's vital, absolutely vital. Yeah.
Well, Gabriella, thank you so much for your time today. I feel like we only
Thank
just
you.
scratched the surface. There's so
Yeah.
much more we could talk about. I'll have to have you back for a part 2 at some
I'd
point.
love to do that. That would be awesome. That really would. I feel very, very privileged to be on your channel. You do incredible stuff. So thank you.
Well, thank you. And I've put the link to your website in the description down below for
Okay.
anybody who wants to contact you or look up your
Fantastic.
training or anything like that.
Yeah.
And I really appreciate it. And thank you so much. And if you guys have any questions for Gabriella that we didn't answer, again, leave them in the comments and we can address them in a part 2. There's so much on this topic of neurodivergency, of safeguarding and spiritual and ritual abuse. We will do many, many more of these, I promise you.
Fantastic.
But thank you so much for everybody who tuned in, and
Yeah,
we'll see
thank
you in the
you
next
for
one.
everyone for giving up your time this evening and listening to us chatting
Listen
on.
to us ramble on.
Yeah.
All right, guys. Thank you so much. We'll see you on the next one.
Bye bye.